Now it's time for Power of Prophecy with your host, former professor at the University of Texas at Austin, career United States Air Force officer, and best-selling author, Texe MARRS.
Hello, friends. This is Texe MARRS. Welcome to another edition of Power of Prophecy. Today's program is going to be an amazing program with a tremendous subject. And really, I've got a great guest to introduce in a minute. One of America's top scholars. But, when you mention scholars, people's eyes get a little glossy. Oh, no, it's going to be one of those boring programs. Well, this gentleman does write scholarly works, but he makes them interesting. And he makes them very readable. If you've been with our ministry a long time, you probably have a couple of his books. And I think you're going to enjoy this book if you don't have it. Now, it's a book that I didn't get around to reading, but I love the subject matter. I love the title. And it seems like God has his timing on everything, of course. And the book's been out there selling for a good time. But recently, it just caught my attention. And I said, I have to get that book and read it. And when I did, I'm going to tell you the truth. This book made me, I'm trying to stop, I'm trying to hold myself back. It made me cry. It made me cry. And I'm a pretty tough customer. You know that. I mean, right here in the ministry, I have a lot of commotion and turmoil, and I'm willing to take on anybody. And I've debated all kind of rascals on the radio and television and been visited by the FBI and had been audited for 4 years or so by the IRS. Then they turned around and audited me personally for 4 years. I don't worry about those people. But when I read this book, I'm trying to stop crying now. Here's the title of the book. They were white and they were slaves. Now, you're not going to find this book in bookstores. I'm not saying maybe some of them do have it. Maybe there's some honest bookstores out there, but not many. And this doesn't fit with what they call today's narrative. And I was recently, my attention was drawn to the Bible. And I thought, this has tremendous biblical Christian significance. They were white and they were slaves. Well, who could that mean? Well, Michael Hoffman, our good friend, he wrote about the strange religion of Judaism, a great book that we offer through the ministry here. I'm going to hold off in introducing Michael Hoffman just a minute and let you know of this Bible quote. I was reading it and I thought, this has a lot. I mean, it doesn't seem to perfectly apply, but then when you start thinking about it, it really does. It's in Revelation 13, verse 10. It says, "He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints." I'm going to read that again. "He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and faith of the saints." Leading into captivity. Michael, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, Michael, a great book. They were white and they were slaves.
Thank you, Texe.
A lot of people are, they have pity. A lot of people have pity for black people in America. And they point back to the slavery issue. I know that the United Nations recently had a panel, and they said that America, of course, they're busybodies. What do they know? But in any case, they came out and they said that America should pay reparations to black people today for having their ancestors as slaves. Of course, I don't know of any I've never met a black person today that knew their ancestors. I guess it'd be great-great-grandfather or whatever. But we know it's been, 160 years since there were slaves in America. But how many people know that there were white slaves in America and all around the world? Now, your book is really an astonishing eye-opener. I'd like to know how you got the idea for this book and how you you wrote it, and just what was going through your mind? I mean, it's I know you got a fertile mind. You're extremely intelligent, but what caused you to write this particular book?
Well, you're very kind, Tex. What caused me to write it is that I'm always fascinated with anomalies in history. Anything like that raises my curiosity, no matter what it is. And as I was surveying literature in my work at that time as a journalist, I'm a former reporter for the Associated Press, I came across a statistic that showed slavery of whites in the medieval days, back in Anglo-Saxon England and in the Viking times. And what I discovered was that there's nothing unusual about white slavery. It seems very unusual to us today because we've been indoctrinated to such an extent concerning the tragic enslavement of black people, but it has become a monopoly. It has completely monopolized the conversation in the field of study, so that in the whole spectrum, the big picture, as it were, we miss entirely a whole epoch of the enslavement of whites. In fact, the very word slave comes from a word for white people, Slav. The Slavs were so heavily enslaved by Viking raiders and others that their name, or a variant of it, became synonymous with and a definition of the word slave. So how could it be illegitimate to talk about white slaves? And of course, we're not talking here about people who take women across state lines for purposes of prostitution. We're talking about chattel enslavement, not indentured servitude. That's something entirely different. So basically, originally to pique my curiosity, I began to study it. And then the more information that I gathered, the more that I saw, this was back in the late 80s, because originally this book was a pamphlet, and then the early 90s. There was very little at that time. Since that time, in the literature of white enslavement, there have been some books, I like to think maybe they were inspired by my book, but I'm not certain, that have since come up, especially with an emphasis on Irish slaves, but that's not my emphasis, because I know that Irish Catholics and the Catholics of England enslaved white Protestants. White Protestants, when they were in power, enslaved the white Irish. So as far as creating any kind of Catholic-Protestant rivalry here, I stay clear of that. And as you know, in my book, it shows both denominations of people being enslaved. But you also mentioned reparations. Where are the reparations for the white slaves in America? And also, since there is this talk about, for example, a janitor at Yale University saw a white person who had owned slaves, and there was a stained glass image of him, he decided to kick the window out, and he hasn't been fired, and he doesn't have to pay any compensation because he felt that was an evil white slaver, and they had a window for him. Well, if enslaving one's fellow man is evil, what about all of the African people who sold their fellow blacks into slavery in the hundreds of thousands? How do we find out who their ancestors are and make them pay reparations? I personally am against this notion that you or I or someone else is supposed to pay for the crimes of their great-great-grandfather. But that's the world we have today, a world of entitlement, and it's very crippling for the souls and spirits and psychology of black people. And I have good news for black people on the program today here at Power of Prophecy, and that is, you are not hereditary slaves. You are not. White people have been slaves throughout history, so it is not in your interest to suppress that because you can free yourself from that crippling psychological burden. I think that's good news, don't you?
Absolutely. Well, anyone who keeps in their mind the slavery thing and how their great-great-great-grandparents or whatever were slaves and uses that as a tool today to lodge out hatred and foment revolution and such against a certain race. I think those people are very sick and very demonic. And I say that because, I was born very poor. And my mom and dad were extremely poor. And we were sort of what you would call white trash, I suppose. But I was raised, I don't know. I never thought of the slavery issue being black or white. But, I used to play with little black fellows and the black boys in the neighborhood. And I didn't think I was any better than they were. And then suddenly, as I got to an adult, suddenly, you had all this racial animosity. Mm-hmm. But as a young kid, I've mentioned this on the radio before several times. Basically, I used to chase rats in the tenement building I lived in, and there were roaches everywhere. When I went to sleep at night, I'd have to wake up at night with roaches all over me, big roaches. I mean, the big Texas kind of cockroaches. So that's sort of the life that I lived. I thought that was the way, most people lived. If you owned a house with a mom and dad, I thought that's fantastic. I didn't, so I lived right across the street from a liquor store. So you can see it was in a urban area. But so who is fit? Who is capable of telling me that Texe MARRS, you have to pay reparations for white privilege? What kind of white privilege did I have as a young boy living across from a liquor store, in downtown traffic? And anyway, you get the drift of where I come from.
Well, in my book, I quote from Eugene Genovese, who is he's deceased now, but was one of the more objective historians of black enslavement. And I took the quote from one of his books where he referred to an interview with black slaves in the big house, in the plantation house, and they were giving the hierarchy of worth in their society. And they said on top was the white master, the big book rows they called them, and down they compared it to a cake. Up at the top, the frosting were the white masters, the plutocrats in the South, and then in the middle of the cake were the black house slaves, and down below that were the white trash. And it wasn't so much that they were expressing hatred for them as actually corroborating the fact that this is how it was in the plantation South. And in fact, this is why Lincoln had the support of the border and mountain whites who refused to fight for the Confederacy, because their wages had been harmed so much by black slaves, the black slave labor, as well as the fact that many of them had been not only dirt poor, but now in the 19th century, we can talk about indentured servitude, the actual chattel enslavement of whites on cotton and tobacco, on sugar and tobacco, not so much cotton plantations in the 17th and 18th centuries, and then that faded out. But there were indentured servitudes, and one of them was a man by the name of Andrew Johnson, who was whipped by his master, mistreated as an indentured boy, and he ran away from North Carolina. There was a $10 reward for him. $10 back then was 10 or 20 times that amount today or more. And he fled to Tennessee, where he ended up entering the state legislature, and in the second administration of Abraham Lincoln became his vice president. That's Vice President Andrew Johnson, who's much hated today because he was very kind to the poor whites of the South after Lincoln was assassinated and he became president. But when some of these black militants who Lincoln had courted came to the White House when Johnson was there, he had no use for them, because most of their repartee and dialogue was centered on the no-good poor whites. And here Johnson was one of them. And so, yes, I think you're absolutely right. This notion of white skin privilege is basically a Marxist idea that has been injected on the college university campuses, that if you're white, just by virtue of the fact that you have this skin color, you have more privileges. Well, actually, I grew up during the civil rights era, Martin Luther King and all of that, and I often thought as I was trying to get into college and get a job that if I had had black skin, I would have been promoted much faster. Now, I know there are black people who disagree with that, but if I were a black man or a black woman, I would want America to be based strictly on merit. Because that way, if it was strictly a meritocracy, when we saw a black person in a high position, whatever it might be in industry, science, education, commerce, we would know that they earned it. Whereas some of us tend to see some of them, I don't know if this is right or wrong, in a high position, we wonder, well, did they get that job because of their merit or because they're a token? And that undermines the really wonderful black people who have worked hard and deserve it. So in America, our meritocracy is on the wane, and unfortunately this Marxist sense of entitlement where one class or race of people owes another class, that's very destructive of the dream of America, which is a unified dream. That's why English should be the official language, and all of us should gather together, not under a flag of Babylon or Babel, the Tower of Babel, but gather as the Founding Fathers intended, under the flag and under our Star-Spangled Banner, grateful to the Founding Fathers for the liberties that we had. But more and more through identity politics, as you know, Tex, we're being fractured and sundered.
Okay, now let's talk about your book a little bit. the first part of it, you go all the way back. You talk about the Arabic, how the Muslims had slaves, and before them, the Arab people, had all these slaves. And then, of course, the Muslims took over, about a half of, Europe at one time. They were to Spain and so forth, and all those areas. And they had slaves, and they took with them, when they conquered those lands in Europe, they grabbed hold of a lot of the people there, and they took them back to the Arab countries as their white slaves.
And the Vikings were just as bad. The Vikings, who I mentioned having enslaved the Slavic people, would also enslave the Scots, the Irish, the English, and sell them to the highest bidder, wherever that was, whether it was in Russia, the Caucasus, or, as you say, in the Arab lands. There's really nothing particularly unique about slavery until we got this abolitionist agitation in the 19th century that made it out to be a unique evil. And, of course, I'm glad that it's been extirpated, but the point is that it's as old as history. And to single out the white race for some special moral turpitude here is really, there's a hidden agenda behind that. But if I may, I'll quote from David Bryan Davis. He's no radical. He wrote in the New York Review of Books, as late as the 14th and 15th century, continuing shipments of white slaves, some of them Christians, flowed from the booming slave markets of the northern Black Sea coast into Italy, Spain, Egypt, and the Mediterranean islands. Then from Barbados to Virginia, colonists showed few scruples about reducing their less fortunate American countrymen to a status little different from that of chattel slaves. The prevalence and suffering of white slaves, serfs, and indentured servants in the early modern period suggests there was nothing inevitable about limiting plantation slavery to people of African origin, end quote. And that's a very important insight, because the first slaves in America were not the blacks. They were the whites who represented a great deal of anxiety to the British ruling class. There was a surplus population. It's hard to believe now, when most of our people are having one or none child, married couples, when God said be fruitful and multiply. But back then they did do that. And so this, what was considered to be a revolutionary element of paupers on the streets of Great Britain, were kidnapped. That was the original use of the word kidnap. It actually was a reference to the stealing of white children. If you look in old dictionaries, you'll see that definition is there. The stealing of white children, nabbing them, nabbing these kids, kidnapping. That became a mass institution, sweeping them off the streets of England onto these slave ships and taking them to Virginia, also to the West Indies, Barbados, Jamaica, and those areas, and enslaving them unto death. Now, the high school and college history teachers will tell the young folks, well, this was indentured servitude, and these folks spent 5 or 7 years in the master's house polishing the silver, and after that, they came out and they became judges and lawyers and rulers of the country. That's not true. In the 17th century, and each period here has to be judged by the century in which you're dealing with. The 18th century experience of white slavery was very different from the 17th, and the 19th was largely indentured. So we have to be sure what era we're talking about. But in the 17th century, the experience of slavery was overwhelmingly chattel slavery of whites. Chattel is another word for cattle, so they were treated like animals. They could be executed. They could be brutalized. You mentioned nearly weeping when you read the stories in the book. One of the reasons why I wrote They Were White and They Were Slaves is to honor and call forth the memory of these forgotten people, because I, too, was greatly moved by their suffering. It's a forgotten, suppressed history. To a certain degree, we white people are a little bit culpable here, because throughout the history of white enslavement, slavery has always been seen as potentially hereditary. In other words, if you're a slave, the question is, was your father or grandfather, is there something wrong with him or your parents or grandparents genetically? And so there was a fear that was a genetic taint. So people did not admit, even going back as far as the Viking era in Iceland and so forth, where white slaves are known as thralls back then. To be a thrall was a hereditary status. If your father was a thrall, you were a thrall. You were born into slavery. And some of that in the Elizabethan and later eras, on the eastern seaboard there and in the Appalachian areas, the people had a memory of being white slaves, but they suppressed it because they thought maybe their daughter wouldn't make a good marriage or would harm them in business. I actually did run into a man who was a descendant of Samuel Hicks. Now, it's spelled in different ways, H-I-X or H-I-C-K-S. They kept the memory alive. That Samuel Hicks in the 17th century had been a white slave, and they were, I believe, in the North Carolina region, and this fellow even told me that was the reason why his great-great-grandparents had not fought in the Civil War. They didn't hold black slaves, they didn't benefit from it, and they didn't feel any sense of alliance with the Confederacy. So I thought that was very interesting. But that's one of the reasons why it's hard to trace this text, and another reason is because it takes a revisionist historian like myself to dig in and find this because it's politically incorrect.
Well, on page 14 of your book, and you give all of your documented quotes, then 1708, there were tens of thousands of young white girls kidnapped from England and enslaved in colonial America. Tens of thousands of young white girls kidnapped, and then you go and take and used as slaves, and they weren't just housekeepers. Most of them were worked to death.
Right.
But you also say the Holocaust against the white poor. This is from your book. You say the desperate condition of the poor whites of Britain was most obvious in the cities. The English slums of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries were pits of white suffering. And then you quote a gentleman who wrote about this. He, a policeman, in fact, opened the door to a tiny shack there in Britain. And it says this, it says, 10, 20, 30, who can count them? Men, women, children, for the most part naked, heaped upon the floor like maggots in a cheese, a spectral rising, unshrouded from a grave of rags. Herman Melville, who you quote here, says this is like living death. He passed through a street and found this woman, a very feeble woman with a little dead baby in her hands and her children. I mean, starving to death. This is an incredible thing. But this happened in Britain at that time. People go back and read the stories of Oliver Twist, and they think those are just novels. But those were true. Those poor kids. But evidently they had so many kids that I remember, and you quote Malthus, who talked about depopulation. He thought it was good for the poor whites to die from hunger, sort of like today's zero population growth. We got to keep the world's population down. And the best thing to happen is not have enough food, and then they just die off. So the people thought, well, that's the way things are. People just die. Millions were just dying around the white world, so to speak.
Yes, and you quoted Herman Melville, and listeners will recall he's the author of Moby Dick, but he's one of the few great American writers who was a professional sailor. And before he wrote the classic Moby Dick, he wrote the book from which I quoted about his true adventure as a sailor going across the Atlantic Ocean, then going to England and being horrified by exactly the type of desperate poverty and penury that he saw the poor whites of England existing in. And we see it here. I don't want to spend too much time on contemporary issues, but I would just say for people who have difficulty understanding this, I'm sorry to use the word hillbilly, I don't mean it disrespectfully, but if some poor white hillbilly is dragged out of a car by a cop, be that cop black or white, and most policemen are good. 99 out of 100 of them are our guardians and our heroes. I agree with that. But let's say one of the bad apples pulls him out of the car and just shoots him down like a dog. Where will there be any mobs or crowds of people arguing for the rights of that dead white individual? Where will there be protests? We won't see that because the poor whites in America are less than human in the eyes of the plutocratic class that rules us. And Hillary Clinton, of course, revealed that when she referred to us as deplorables. But this actually has a very long legacy because one of the things I point out in the book, Texe, is that the structures, I quote from Hilary Beckles in the book White Servitude, white slavery was the historic base upon which Negro slavery was constructed. She said the important structures, the labor ideologies, and social relations necessary for slavery already had been established within indentured servitude. white servitude in many ways came remarkably close to the ideal type of chattel slavery which later became associated with the African experience, end quote. And she's basically still stuck on that indentured servitude phrase because they just can't let go of it, even though here she's saying it was remarkably close to the chattel slavery which black people experienced. But, you know, when you've been indoctrinated, it can be very tough to shake that off. Yeah, Oliver Twist, the chimney sweep, Dickens was himself a child of the factory system, which the Southern people of the Confederacy, they pointed to the hypocrisy among the white abolitionists who own these horrible factories in the North, where children would, as young as 6 years old, would go to work before the sun came up and leave work after the sun came down, so they barely ever saw the sun. And this is what was transpiring in the 19th century while the abolitionists were preaching to the Southerners. And meanwhile, in Great Britain, while legislation was being written about ending the British black slavery, little boys, 4, 5, and 6 years old, were climbing up these red-hot chimneys to clean the ashes out of them, and the aristocrats could have cared less. Charles Dickens worked in what was known as a blacking factory, a shoe polish factory, at the age of 12. And I really believe God gave him that experience so that he would have a fund of information from which to base his very factual books. And Oliver Twist is a case of which that boy would have probably been killed or severely injured or maimed had he been one of those climbing boys, as the chimney sweeps were called. Now we romanticize it in Mary Poppins and other things like that. It was a real horror. So there's a lot of hypocrisy here, and I open my book with a quote from Shakespeare, "Now step I forth to whip hypocrisy." And that's really one of the subtexts of my book.
When people read this book, they cannot imagine. I mean, there's a picture, and I put it in my newsletter. Boy, I get so upset at this. I have this picture of these 3 little white girls, slave girls. Let's just call them what they are, slave girls, in these filthy, dirty dresses. And there they are standing out, and you know, and you say that these young white slave girls would work 16 hours a day. They were regularly beaten with leather straps or a billy roller, a monstrous iron bar. They were often raped by their masters, forced to perform obscene sex acts. And I say it was better to be black than white when white slavery was the order of the day in forgotten America. And so these little white girls, these little girls, beautiful, lovely little girls, we think of children as, well, you know, during their childhood, let's just give them room to play and to study. But back then, they didn't think about them going to school. They thought about them going to work at 4 or 5 years of age, 16 hours a day, and they had all these male workers, these adults, would beat them and give them very little food, and they would basically work them to death. And there were millions, probably thousands, in all these factories, their arms torn off, get caught in machines, and they're just discarded like a bunch of rotten wood. There's no insurance. There's no laws against this. They would beat these kids and force them into labor. This is almost unbelievable. It's incredible, the horror. And these children spent their whole life like that until they died. They worked them to death.
Well, they had a very, very low status. If you look at the Waltham Black Act of 1723, the obstreperous poor whites were considered such a threat to the British Crown that the Crown decided to create a system wherein misdemeanors would render you capital punishment. So in other words, if you broke down an aristocrat's fish pond, if you poached deer on his estate, if you stole lace or a loaf of bread, these were crimes punishable by execution. That was a way of just getting rid of these people. Now, they would be offered slavery in North America. This was prior to the American Revolution. Once we won the revolution against the British had to find another slavery dumping ground for whites, and that was Australia. But this is in colonial America. You were offered either a lifetime of enslavement in colonial America or to hang. And I remember quoting from one of the people who was about to be sentenced. He had heard by letter or some type of dispatch what the life was like for the white slaves in North America, and he actually told the judge, "I would rather strangle for a few moments on Tyburn Gallery than spend a lifetime of suffering as a white slave in America." That's right. A lot of my research comes from the diaries and original records there. And so a very low status for white people, there's no question about it.
All right. We're going to be back in just a minute. My friend Michael Hoffman is my guest today. We're looking at his book and discussing it. They were white and they were slaves. I'm Texe MARRS. Stay with us here on Power of Prophecy. They were white and they were slaves. Well, nobody really thinks about that, do they? Were there really white slaves in America? Did thousands of them come over? Were they kidnapped? Were they rounded up as kids and forced to come over here? And were they worked to death as little kids? Were there no laws against this? And who are the monsters who brought them into captivity? And not only that, but here in white America, were the blacks who were slaves, did they have black slave masters sometime that had black slaves in America? Could that be? And what about some Indian tribes? Why, in this book, it's an amazing book. You're going to find out that the Cherokee Indians had their own plantations and they had black slaves. The Indians. Why, I thought the Indians were always lily pure and they were always mistreated by the white man. Come to find out, they had black slaves too. Maybe they should be paying reparations. Instead, we give them their own reservations and give them these casinos. And, anyway, it's an amazing story. And now with Black Lives Matter, what about these white lives? Thousands of them. They perished. They were treated pitifully. And I want you to have this book. Maybe you'll cry too when you read it. You know, Wanda recently read a book and she was, she usually reads right before she goes to sleep. She lays in bed and she gets a book out and reads a little bit of it. And I looked at her over there and she was about ready to cry. And I said, well, my goodness, what are you reading there? And I think she said, this is called The Orphan Train. I said, The Orphan Train? She said, yeah, back in the 1800s, they took little kids from the cities back east, and they were too poor. The parents didn't even have money to give them a food or buy them clothes and such. They weren't required to go to school. And so the parents had to do something with their kids. And so these people developed this idea of shipping them on trains to the West, where they went back and West. They said, we'll find good families for them, foster families that will keep, track of them, and they'll be used as servants, but they'll be well treated. Well, they weren't well treated. They went back and they were put with these families that horribly mistreated them. You wouldn't believe it. It was, they were slaves, and they were beaten and made to do terrible things. And that was in America. They had entire train loads of these kids. No, my friends, many people are extremely cruel. You must have this book. I want you to have this book. You'll read about slavery all the way back to the biblical times. In fact, I'm going to ask Michael Hoffman what happened in biblical times. And are there people today that want to make you and I slaves? How about the Jews? How about their Talmud? Could it be that's what they want to do to us? Oh my. Listen, black men. You have a lot of black people that listen to my radio show. I want you to understand. There were white people and they were slaves. You need to read this book. Maybe it'll wake you up a little bit too. And you'll understand that we're all here on earth to serve God. And there's no distinction or difference among us that we don't make ourselves, because God didn't make it. Well, this book is just $18. $18. Please include $5 for shipping and handling. A total of $23. As for the book, They Were White and They Were Slaves by Michael Hoffman. Now, you can go to our website, powerofprophecy.com, and order this book. Or you can just phone us toll free, 1-800-234-9673. Or write to us here at Power of Prophecy, 1708 Patterson Road, Patterson Road, Austin, Texas, 78733. All right, let's return to our regular program now. My good friend Michael Hoffman, he's been a friend a long time, written great books that we've offered through the ministry here. And this is another one. This is one that defies the imagination. It's scholarly, it's academic, but it reads, well, I tell you, if you don't cry, I want to hear from you. It's going to make you cry probably thinking about these poor kids. And, by the way, adults too. Worked to death, mistreated. They were slaves, and they were white. Michael, welcome back to Power of Prophecy.
Thank you, Texe. It's good to be here.
You know, I mentioned on the air, we were talking that the Jews have in their plan, in their Talmud, the intent that all Gentile people, everybody who's not Jewish, they say will be made slaves by their Messiah. So they're looking forward to having, 60 or 70 white slaves, every Jew. That's pretty sickening, isn't it?
Yes, and in the book, The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, there's 2 volumes to it. It documents with old-time scholarship, very impressive, the role of Judaic people in the enslavement of blacks, how they owned the ships and how they were allied with the Ku Klux Klan and were very much part of the Southern Confederacy. They only turned onto the civil rights thing when they saw which way the wind of the zeitgeist was blowing in the 20th century. But prior to that, they had been firmly in the camp of the slave party. This is largely unknown. And I do recommend those 2 books. There's a volume 3, that's on Leo Frank, the Judaic guy who raped the white woman and then blamed it on black people. That part is often overlooked. The people who wrote that book about Leo Frank, The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, volume 3, said that it was a lynching of a guilty man. In other words, he was dragged out of the jail and lynched because he had been granted commutation of his death sentence, and then the local people took the law into their own hands. But the blacks historians who wrote that book said it was the lynching of a guilty man. I thought that was interesting. Now, in the white slave era that we're talking about, from the 1600s up into the end of colonial America, that was largely in the hands of Gentiles, I'm sorry to say. Brother selling brother, and that was the system. Very little culpability on the part of Judaics. Many greedy whites were involved there, and that's the tragedy of history, but that's how it was.
Now, when these white slaves came over,
yes,
they had no laws to protect them, and evidently their masters, if they tried to escape, many times the master would beat them to death, and there was no penalty for the master.
Yeah, we have eyewitness testimony. Richard Ligon was a traveling writer, and he traveled through the Caribbean, and he said that he saw a white slave beaten with a cane about the head till the blood had flowed for a fault that is not worth speaking of. Yet he must be patient, or he will be beaten worse. Now, I wonder, Tex, how many white tourists today who take winter vacations in Caribbean islands like Jamaica and Barbados know that they're visiting the site of a gruesome Holocaust against poor white people who died by the tens of thousands and were slaves in those islands long before black people. In fact, the names redneck and hillbilly actually come from the black people first encountered. The whites were slaves there in the Caribbean, then blacks were brought in, and they saw these whites that they'd never seen before working in fields with their necks getting all red. That's where we get the name redneck, and they would call them Scotland Johnnies and hillbillies. So a lot of these terms of derision for whites actually come from how black slaves, maybe not being hateful, just trying to think up of a nickname, but that's how institutionalized the white enslavement was. This isn't any temporary thing. This isn't indentured servitude. It lasted for hundreds of years, and you mentioned thousands. According to what I've been able to piece together, it was actually well more than 100,000 whites were enslaved in this way, possibly several 100,000. It's hard to get the statistics, and I don't want to be guilty of exaggerating. But at the same time, your listeners should know that my book is often used as a source for genealogical researchers, because since I'm covering suppressed ground here, they use the book to find out where their ancestors were in relationship to the white enslavement cycle. Were they slavers or were they the enslaved? So that's also an interesting feature of the research.
You know, you have on page 113 of your book a letter from a woman, a white slave Elizabeth Spriggs. Now, this was September 22nd, 1756. Now, that was only a quarter of a century before, 1776, our independence. This was during the time of American independence. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, all that. This white slave was here in the United States, Elizabeth Spriggs, in Maryland, and she wrote back to her father in England, and she said, "Honored father, oh dear father, I am sure you'll pity your distressed daughter. What we unfortunate English people suffer here is beyond the probability of you in England to conceive. Let it suffice that I am one of the unhappy number, toiling day and night, and very often in the horse's druggery, with only the comfort of hearing me called, 'You bitch, you did not do half enough.' Then I am tied up and whipped to that degree that you'd not serve an animal. I have scarce anything but Indian corn and salt to eat, and that even begrudged. Nay, many Negroes are better used. After slaving after master's pleasure, what rest we can get is to wrap ourselves up in a blanket and lay upon the ground. This is the deplorable condition your poor Betty endures." Now think about that. I mean, this is so many of these young women evidently were told, go to America. You'll have a better life there. You don't have anything in England. You're so poor. You're a pauper. Go to America and we'll take care of you. They were tricked into coming in. Once they were here, that's it. Their parents couldn't do anything about it. And they were just used as a slave. And nobody, there were no police. There were nothing to stop these poor children. And I put Elizabeth Spriggs in that category. And your book has account after account, true accounts of these poor people.
Yes, that one's from the one you just quoted is from the Public Record Office in London in the High Court of Admiralty, and as you said, September 22nd, 1756. Yes, it's all documented. It took a great deal of digging, but we found it. We also noticed that quite often slaves were referred to as servants, and I've had historians criticize me and say, well, look, in the documents it says servant, and you're claiming they were slave. And I point out that many of these people, their literacy was derived from the King James Bible. And as you know, the King James uses the word servant, where in the original Hebrew it will say slave. And quite often black slaves are referred to as servant. So it's not ipso facto delegitimizing to my thesis for the documents to say that a white person was a servant. You have to look at the context and circumstances of their bondage to discover whether or not they actually were an indentured servant or if, in fact, they were a chattel slave. And as I say, in the 17th century, the majority were indeed chattel slaves.
Now, today, in the 21st century, there are slaves, and white slaves. Among the Jews, I was just reading of a Jewish rabbi in New York who was upset because the Jews of New York, and I'm talking about the Orthodox Jews, practice pedophilia. He says over 50% of all the Jewish males there in New York, I think it's in the Bronx, have pedophile sex with little boys. And they have bathhouses all over New York. And this Jewish rabbi, he's trying to stop that. He's a good guy, let's just say. Over 50%, and these poor little boys are abused, and their parents allow it because, the rabbinical councils, they can't go to the cops. They'll be shunned and, just kicked out of their communities. They don't want that. Now, evidently, this is very prominent among the Jews, and it's prominent among the Arabs, the Muslims. I was reading among in Afghanistan, among the Taliban or the ex-Taliban, these U.S. soldiers were outraged when they heard this Afghani. He was having sex with a little boy in his living quarters, and the little boy was screaming, and the pedophile, homosexual sex. And the guys went and rescued the little boy. And then the Obama administration ordered that these guys be, punished for interfering with the pedophile act. They were told by their superiors, let the people have their pedophile sex. Now, what are we over there for if we're going to let these monsters terrorize these little boys with pedophilia?
Well, in my view, we shouldn't be over there intervening in Muslim civil wars that have been ongoing for 1,000 years. But I would like to point out to your listeners that Christian people did not inherently view black people in the Middle Ages, for example, and earlier, in the early church days, as inherently slave material. This comes from Judaism. It comes from the Midrash. The Midrash has a commentary which twists the meaning of the Old Testament. It's a subsidiary text of the Talmud itself. And in the Midrash, it identifies Ham as being black. Now, if you look at your Bible, you will see that there is no racial color identification of Ham. This was added as the way the rabbis tack these things on, these glosses, which Christ condemned in Matthew 15 and Mark 7 as being the traditions of men. And then we go to Rabbi Maimonides, who is a hero to the liberals and progressives. He's supposed to be a fount of rabbinic wisdom and prudence compared to these horrible Christian priests and ministers, don't you know? And in Maimonides, in the uncensored University of Chicago publication of his book, Guide of the Perplexed. It's not Guide for the Perplexed. It's called Guide of the Perplexed. In the Shlomo Pines translation, that's the only one I found in English that's uncensored. All the others censor this out. In Volume 3, he says that black people are less than human. They are halfway between a human being and an ape. Now, I have gone through the texts of Protestant ministers, and many of them resisted Maimonides, to their credit, and many did not. They were swept up in the idea that Judaism had been persecuted by Catholicism. They despised Catholicism, so they went looking for wisdom in the precincts of Judaism. And there they found Maimonides, who is the most important halakhic or legal authority for the Ashkenazic Judaics, even though he himself was Spanish Judaic. But nonetheless, there in the Guide of Perplexed is that statement. And so that deeply influenced the Christian culture, both Protestant and to a certain degree Catholic, with this identification of black people as being a hereditary race of slaves. And that was very, very destructive of blacks. And boy, do Judaic historians try to steer clear of that, and academia in general, because if we could point this out and prove it, then who's going to have to pay the reparations?
Let's talk about that reparations a little bit. First of all, we see these blacks. They've now been gathered, really, I guess, since the 30s, 40s, and 50s, into these white enclaves. Basically, they're plantations without any crops in these inner cities. So we have these thousands, teeming hundreds of thousands of blacks. And, of course, they exist only by the largesse of the government. So the government gives these black people the goodies, the welfare payments and so forth, or they couldn't exist at all. So they're in the same situation, aren't they, as the young white kids of, let's say, the 1700s. So many white kids, not enough jobs, not enough work for them. So they were sent here to America to be slaves. They toiled their lives away. Many died at an early age from being, starved to death or beaten to death and so forth. Now, the blacks are not beaten because we allow them on their own. But it seems like a terrible thing now. They have no jobs. They have no prospects. What kind of deal is that? I mean, it seems to be a cruel thing to leave these blacks in these inner cities with no prospects of work or jobs or
Well, it is. I mean, first of all, they respected us when we respected ourselves. If you look at the tremendous amnesty that actually existed, Hollywood atrocity films to the contrary, there was goodwill and good feelings between black and white in the Old South. And, of course, the white people at that time held themselves in a very dignified manner, believing themselves to be children of God who would be redeemed by Jesus Christ. They didn't just roll out of bed, put on a jogging suit, and go down to the drugstore. They dressed up for church. They dressed up to go out. They maintained high standards of integrity, and therefore other races respected us. And it's our fault when we dropped those standards that then we lost the respect of some of the other races. So that's one way to get it back. And I think the other thing, Texe, that I'm very worried about is guys like Glenn Beck and others of that ilk who have now created this new so-called conservatism in which Martin Luther King is supposed to be an asset and a good guy. How could he have been a good guy when his FBI file was sealed at the time after he was enshrined as a hero of the United States, and it won't be opened still for another few years? That seems rather strange about a great hero, but mainly Martin Luther King stole from blacks and whites the right to decide who you would serve in your business, who would you rent your home to, and as a result of that, from that type of civil rights law, we have the lesbian homosexuals who are demanding that a baker has to either provide, or a florist has to either provide baked goods or flowers for a so-called gay, I never use that word, but because it means joy, not gay, but a sodomite wedding or a lesbian wedding. It all comes from this civil rights law, which is beginning to trump the Constitution. And so we have to repudiate Martin Luther King and go back to the days of Booker T. Washington, who was someone who told the black people, you have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And if you look at the history of black people prior to the civil rights movement, now they should have been allowed to vote, and a lot of the chicanery that went on, probably not just in the South, but it did happen in the South, where they were cheated out of the vote and representation that was wrong. But otherwise, you had black businesses. You had the Guardian all-black insurance company down south. They ran restaurants. They ran hotels because no one was telling them, you're entitled to this welfare. You know, if you look at the successful parents, be they black, white, or purple, do not tell their children, you are entitled to a free ride in life. If you and I want to empower our children, we know what we're going to tell them. We're going to tell them life is hard, and you need to support yourself. You need to get an education. You need to be responsible. And it is a crippling and anti-black phenomenon when black people are being told they're owed all of these things because of something that allegedly happened 150 or 160 years ago. It's very crippling and it's very anti-black, and I think it's part of the conspiracy that you alluded to earlier of making all of us slaves, not just the white people, but also the black people, being enslaved by a super class, a Brahmin class, an overclass, of which Hillary Clinton and those of her ilk are a part.
Oh, absolutely. You mentioned earlier in the program these Marxist ideas, that a certain class of people or a race of people are entitled to various things, where others born into, a certain race or a class, they're born evil, or they're born, like with white privilege. It's an astonishment to me, and I can't quite figure out how all this supposedly is supposed to work.
Well, it almost seems like an extension of the Talmudic mentality, because the Talmudic mentality decrees that all non-Jews are tainted.
Oh, yeah, because a Jew doesn't consider himself a white person. He's a Jew, regardless of the color of his skin.
Well, yes, in Judaism, Western civilization is cursed. There's no question about that, especially in association with their festival of the 9th of Av. Instead of being grateful to Western civilization, there's a curse. And I'm not talking about Judaic people here, because I was raised in a family that taught me to hate the sin and love the sinner. So I have no hatred in my heart for Judaic people who are lost in the coils of Talmudic enslavement, but I will not mince words when it comes to that Talmudic religion itself, which is a fount of evil.
Absolutely. Well, back to the reparations. Some years ago, I think it's been about 6 or 7 years ago, I discovered a black man who helped other blacks in the what we would call a ghetto here in Austin, helped them to do their income tax, their 1040s. And this was quite interesting because he was helping these blacks who really had no money as such, probably didn't even need to turn in a 1040. But what he was doing was, there's a little place on there where you can put down a certain amount. So they would come down to the fact that they weren't owed anything, or they didn't owe anything. And then he would write in reparations payment, $20,000. Now, evidently this has gotten started in some of the ghettos, and these black tax advisors were telling the blacks, you can do this. Just go ahead and ask for $20,000 reparations. Well, I did some checking at the time, and I discovered that the IRS was allowing that to pass.
Wow.
And I want to just say right now, you won't see this in the newspapers, but I believe as many as 2 to 3 million blacks every year fill out a 1040. It may not have any other blanks filled, but they on the one thing so as far as a refund sent to them, they are all asking for a $20,000 reparation payment. So they believe
what they're doing in many ways is copying the Judaic people who say they are so-called Holocaust survivors of World War II, They see them getting all of these reparations and the Germans paying this guilt money, and then they see an enormous Holocaust museum in Washington, D.C., even though the United States had no role in the persecution of Judaics under Hitler. In fact, we fought a war to stop it. And I think that's where they themselves kind of feel aggrieved, and they say, well, these Judaics, they're getting all this money and all of this Holocaust publicity. What about us? I think that there is a little bit of envy there and anger at the idea that there's a special category of aggrieved persons, the Zionists of World War II, and then the black people feel that they're not part of that they want a piece of that pie. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's unfortunate that the crippling sense of entitlement is something which they have been inveigled with. It would be so much better, as you say, if they could simply be independent of this. But that's part of the intentional crippling of the minds of black people in America. Tell them they're hereditary slaves, and then instead of running their own businesses, they need to have affirmative action and reparations. And it's just going to end up with the destruction of the black race if something doesn't change.
Well, that's true. And it may also end up with the destruction of the white race, too, because I mean, right now, I understand, we have a big IRS center here, and I've talked with some friends who work for the IRS, and they tell me that it is now official policy. The IRS knows this is going on. They know that this is a national situation, and they have orders, evidently from higher ups, in the Obama administration, to look the other way and pay out the $20,000.
You should document that because that's electrifying news.
Well, I doubt if it would mean anything to anybody. They would probably say, oh, that's great. That's wonderful. What can you say? But
but that means that we're being taxed.
Oh, yeah,
that we're working so many months out of the year in order to pay these reparations. I don't owe anyone any reparations, and it sounds from your childhood that neither do you. And as far as the comment that you made just briefly a few moments ago about the white race being destroyed, I agree with you, but unfortunately it's self-destruction because we're electing leaders who seem to hate us, and we ourselves are self-extinguishing by refusing to rely on the abundance and providence of God by having all the children that He wants to send us. One of the great crimes that has afflicted the white race, and just like Israel of old, He's going to send us into enslavement if we don't change our ways and become faithful.
Oh, that's true. Absolutely. Well, your book is just so wonderful here, and man, I'm reading page 106, the torture and murder of white slaves. The white slaves were punished with merciless whippings and beatings. You show the records of Middlesex County in Virginia. Boy, it's just it's amazing. So many of these, and it says here many of the white slaves had to exist with iron collars and chains. Boy, here's one whipped till he was bloody. I mean, these are whites, and they were slaves, folks. Listen, Michael Hoffman has done us all a great service in giving us this book. They were white, and they were slaves. Michael, when they see this Black Lives Matter, people ought to be boiled up with anger. I mean, I know it's George Soros, the communist, the Marxist, Obama, Hillary Clinton. All of them are trying to feed into this, trying to foment revolution, and stir up a hatred among blacks. And many blacks do hate the whites. They bought into this, haven't they?
Yes. Now, that is something that is a sin that doesn't get mentioned. We hear about anti-black racism being a sin, and it is a sin. And then we refuse to acknowledge the existence, very virulent, of anti-white racism, which is also a sin and ought to be condemned. Wow.
Well, Michael, we're running out of time here. I wish we had more time, because there's so many examples and so many stories here. Folks, get it. This book, They Were White and They Were Slaves. We have many copies. I'm sure Michael will print as many more as we need. Please order it. Please give it to your friends, your black friends. And if you're black, you want to know about this. Be fair to yourself and liberate yourselves from prejudice. Read this book. They Were White and They Were Slaves. Michael, thank you so much for being on Power of Prophecy today.
Tex, thank you for giving me the opportunity to liberate our people from guilt, one of the most crippling things when it's a false guilt that any human being can experience. Thank you, Tex.
That's absolutely true. Well, God bless you, Michael.
You too.
My friends, until next time, this is Tex MARRS reminding you to tune in and discover the power of prophecy.